with this issue through research, and I actually spent some additional time this past week looking at this issue more in preparation for this message. But the more that I look at this issue, the more I'm convinced that worry is becoming an epidemic in our culture. And I was thinking about this. The logical message to follow up on that one would be a message on the Sabbath or on rest, because I believe that much of our worry stems from the fact that we've just overloaded our lives with work and all this extracurricular activities and all these different commitments that we have that just keep us running from place to place to the point where it seems at times we're at a breaking point in our lives. And it affects us. Studies show that it affects us physically, financially, emotionally, spiritually, really in just about every way. So there is this need for us to talk about the issue of the Sabbath, because whether you know it or not, I think we all are pretty much guilty of not keeping the Sabbath in our lives. The Sabbath is a part of a pattern to living or a flow to life that God instilled from the very beginning of creation that I believe is still applicable to us today. And just because you're here at church today, or just because you're not working today, doesn't necessarily mean that you're keeping the Sabbath, at least in the spirit in which God intended it to be kept. The Sabbath was meant to be a day of rest, a day where you just stopped, a day where you reflected and enjoyed the fruits of your labor. And I'm not so sure that what we do on most Sundays outside of church actually qualifies for any of those. So there really is a need to speak on this issue of the Sabbath, but not today. Today, I want to talk about the idea of playing, which is why I had you play that game. Play is different than rest in obvious ways, but the truest form of play is when it has no secondary purpose. It's just all about having fun. It's all about the joy. In his book, The Rest of Life, the New Testament scholar Ben Witherington defines play as an activity that is an end in itself, not merely a means to an end, and it generates its own joy just in the play. So this means practice is not play. Neither is conditioning. Your exercise class or your yoga class at the gym is not play. Neither are the dance lessons that you or your children might take. Because all of these have a secondary goal, to get you into shape, to help make you play whatever sport better, to help your team perform better together. But play is different. Play is diving into a pile of leaves for absolutely no apparent reason. Play is just kneeling on the floor, surrounded by a bunch of Barbie dolls and making up a scene for your child to act out. Play is building with blocks or making a sand castle or throwing the ball around or splashing around in a pool. Play can be a game of golf. It can be a game of cards. It can be whipping out that favorite family board game, but where winning isn't the overriding purpose behind why you play. Play is not necessarily learning to dance. It's just dancing. It's not practicing scales or rehearsing a song. It's just making music. Play has no agenda other than just the joy of playing. And some social scientists have begun to take play quite seriously. And they are learning that play matters. They are finding connections between the amount of time people spend playing and other aptitudes like social skills, emotional health, and problem solving. How we play, what we play, and how often we play are good predictors, they say, of how well we might do at other things in life. So play is more than just a distraction from what we think are the more important things in life. You know, the things that we tend to spend a lot of our time worrying about. Play is vital to our mental and social health. Having said that, though, it's not easy to do a sermon on play. Rest or keeping the Sabbath, on the other hand, is nowhere near as hard. Because as most of you know, Sabbath keeping is one of the 10 Commandments. It's talked about quite a bit in the Old Testament. It's also brought up pretty frequently in the life of Jesus. And so there's a lot of text material for that. Play is different, though. I found there's no commandment out there that says, thou shalt play, even though I kind of wish there was. There's no section of the Bible that's devoted to play. There's no parables that Jesus ever taught that involve the idea of play. There's no prophecies that speak directly about play as being a part of the future kingdom of God. So the scriptural evidence for play is slim. However, I do believe there is evidence, and I think it's found all around us. And there is this story that I read that I think will help to illustrate this. It's a story about two men in the country of Germany, and it goes like this. In that part of Germany that borders on the Rhine River, there is a noble castle which lifts its old gray towers above the ancient forest, where dwelt a nobleman who had a good and devoted son, his comfort and his pride. Once when the son was away from home, a Frenchman visited, and in course of conversation spoke in such unbecoming terms of the great Father in heaven as to chill the old man's blood. "Are you not afraid of offending God," said the Baron, "by speaking in this way?" The foreigner answered with cool indifference that he knew nothing about God, for he had never seen him. The next morning the Baron pointed out to the visitor a beautiful picture which hung on the wall of the castle and said, "My son drew that." "He must be a clever youth," returned the Frenchman blandly. Later in the day, as the two gentlemen were walking in the garden, the Baron showed his guests the many rare plants and flowers, and on being asked who managed the garden, the Baron said with proud satisfaction, "My son, and he knows every plant, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop on the wall." "Indeed," observed the Frenchman, "I shall soon have a very exalted opinion of him." The Baron then took his visitor to the village and showed him a beautiful structure which his son had built for a school where the children of the poor were daily instructed free of expense. "What a happy man you must be," said the Frenchman, "to have such a son." "How do you know I have a son?" asked the Baron with a grave face. "Why, because I have seen his works. I am sure he must be both clever and good, or he would not have done all you have shown me." "But you've never seen him," returned the Baron. "No, but I already know him very well because I can form a just estimate of him from his works." "I'm not surprised," said the Baron in a quiet tone. "And now oblige me by coming to this window and tell me what you see." "Why, I see the sun traveling through the skies and shedding its glories over one of the greatest countries of the world. And I behold a mighty river at my feet and a vast range of woods and pastures and orchards and vineyards and cattle and sheep feeding in rich fields." "Do you see anything good in all of this?" asked the Baron. "Well, of course I can," said the Frenchman. "Well then," said the Baron, "if you are able to judge of my son's good character by seeing his various works, how does it happen you can form no estimate of God's goodness by witnessing such proofs of his handiwork?" Now, what I take from that story is that there is evidence of God within creation itself. And if there is evidence of God within creation, then we can deduce some of God's character from what we observe in creation, if not at least catch a glimpse of what is God's original purposes or intentions for creation. The Bible says in Hebrews chapter 11, and I like the way that the World English Bible translates this, it says, "By faith we understand that the universe has been framed by the word of God, so that what is seen has not been made out of things which are visible." Now, that word framed carries the meaning of being fashioned or being put into order or being equipped for its intended purpose. So what that means is that there is intentionality behind the created order. That many of the things that we witness taking place in creation was in fact designed by God. Now, we know that human beings throughout the centuries have always played. From the ancient Olympics to the modern version of the Olympics, from some guys in Scotland in the 15th century hitting a little white ball into a hole to the US Open, which is going to crown a champion later today. And there are many, many, many more examples. But in every culture across time, there has always been an element of play in the life of its people. As one author put it, we appear to be hardwired for play. And it's not just us as human beings. I mean, we're not alone in that. We also see play throughout the animal kingdom. Those of you who own dogs, you must be familiar with the posture that dogs take when they want to play, right? It looks a little bit like this. They tend to put their face lower to the ground. Their rear end kind of goes up. They wag their tails, and this is their invitation to play. Almost any mammal that I can think of engages in a form of play. We know that cats play. We know that bears play. We know that even dolphins play. During the fall last year, I took my daughter Becca to a pumpkin patch, which was on a farm not too far from our house. And we spent some time walking around looking at the different animals on the farm. Well, we got to this pig pen, and there were these two little pigs in the pen. And while we were watching them, for whatever reason, they all of a sudden just broke out and started playing with each other. And one pig started chasing the other pig around the pen, and they were like, scurrying around, kicking up dust and snorting. And I thought it was kind of comical, but it was also eye-opening because I never really thought that pigs played like that before. Now, there was a time when science dismissed the idea that animals played with each other just for the sheer sake of enjoyment. What looked like play, they said, was actually a rehearsing of behavior that was necessary for survival in nature. But more recently, this idea has shifted due to the results of different studies that have been conducted. In one experiment that was done on cats, they took these kittens and they deprived them of any form of play throughout their entire developmental period all the way to adulthood. Now, the scientists expected that when these cats were full grown, they would wind up being less proficient hunters because they never practiced the skills of chasing and pouncing that most cats do when they're playing. What they found, though, was that the play-deprived cats were able to hunt just as well as all the other cats who had played all their lives. There was a difference, but the difference had nothing to do with hunting. What the play-deprived cats lacked, they found, was social skills. Another study found that bears that play together in the wild more actually survive longer. And again, it's not because play teaches them how to fish or to hunt better, but somehow play in and of itself helps them to live longer or survive longer. And so the scientific community is becoming increasingly convinced that it's natural selection that has chosen play as a means of survival. Whereas those of us who come from a place of faith or see things through the lens of faith would say that when God created human beings in his image, when God made creation, he did so in such a way, or he built into the fabric of creation, or he framed creation in such a way that there is this element of play. So either way, play matters. But of course, it comes from two totally different perspectives. Let me share with you this really interesting incident that gained notoriety in the scientific world. It's about this individual. His name is Norbert Rosing, who is this German nature photographer whose work you'll often find in National Geographic. Rosing was in Manitoba, which is near the Hudson Bay, I think in northern Canada, preparing to take pictures of polar bears after their hibernation, which is one of his specialties, polar bears. One day, while he was waiting for any signs of a polar bear to show up, he just began taking pictures of his dogs to pass the time. He had these two huskies that he had tethered to the ground. Well, suddenly, from out of nowhere, and before he could react, a 1,200-pound wild male polar bear appeared. It had what one scientist by the name of Stuart Brown called a predatory gaze, which is that fixed stare, they say, that animals get when they're on the hunt. And this polar bear was likely on the hunt, having not eaten now for about 4 months. Norbert, remaining ever the photographer that he is, continued to snap pictures, even though he said his heart was in his stomach because he was convinced that his dogs were about to be ripped apart and eaten by this polar bear. While examining this picture after the fact, this Dr. Stuart Brown noticed something, and that is that the husky, he said on the right, which is more in the foreground, which is the female, he says at one point, and even in this picture somewhat, is in the play posture, kind of bowing a little bit at the front, and that her tail was up and wagging, that she was in essence inviting the bear to play. The polar bear responds by first making kind of a threatening gesture, but again, Dr. Brown notes that his claws and teeth are not exposed, that this is not an aggressive attack, this is something else. The dog continues to invite the bear to play, and at some point the two actually begin to engage and play. And at one point, the polar bear even puts his mouth around the dog's neck and could have easily killed the dog in a matter of seconds. But this has now obviously turned into a form of playing between two animals that Rosing never could have imagined would take to playing with each other. Dr. Brown would write specifically about this picture, and he says, if you look closely at this, the throat of the husky is open to the bite of the polar bear. But the bear's eyes are half closed. He's in a different state of being. The signals of play that the husky sent to the bear have produced mutual bliss. They've overcome the bear's predatory urges, all produced by the unmistakable language of play. And here's some other images of the polar bear and the dog playing together. Rosing reported that the playing lasted for about 20 minutes until they finally just laid down side by side, panting happily. And Dr. Brown would comment later that their playing, or their dance as he called it, was a marvelous example of how a differential in power can be overridden by a process of nature that's within all of us. Rosing would later share that this same bear would return to his camp every day for about 2 weeks to play with his dogs, even at one point bringing another bear along. And that this continued until the water in the bay had frozen, and then the bears were off to hunt. Odd friends between these animals who would never naturally be friends, but they became friends all because of their willingness to play. Dr. Stewart says that play brings us into an altered state of bliss, as he calls it. It brings us together in ways that nothing else can, like a bear and a dog, or a high school senior and a sixth grader, or a senior citizen and an elementary school student, or even people from vastly different cultures, as we now see happening with the World Cup. Now, I bring all of this up in large part because it's Father's Day, and because recent studies have shown the importance of fathers in the lives of their children, and even the importance of how fathers play with their children. Up until recently, researchers studying parents' influence on their kids paid barely any attention to the role played by their fathers. They have thousands upon thousands of studies over time that sliced and diced and analyzed the benefits for children of having a close, nurturing relationship with their mothers. More recent studies, however, have begun to reveal the importance of a father's relationship with his children. In fact, in 2012, 36 studies on parental rejection and acceptance was conducted around the world, and it found that being loved by fathers was frequently a better predictor of a child's overall happiness and life satisfaction than their sense of being loved by their mothers. In addition, it came to the conclusion that dad's rejection was also a better predictor of substance abuse, depression, and behavioral problems. One doctor from the University of Connecticut who helped to conduct the study said that that information came as a bombshell to us. Many people just assume that a mother's love is what always matters most. In another area of research that came out, it was discovered that fathers may actually matter more than mothers in terms of vocabulary development in their children. And the hypothesis behind this is that mothers who spend more time with their children know their children's vocabularies better. But what they do is they then tend to tailor their own word choice accordingly when speaking to their children. Fathers, they say, on the other hand, don't know their children as well, and so they just end up using vocabulary that the children aren't familiar with, but this actually serves to introduce them to new words. Here's an interesting one. I'm going to end with this. It's an article from the Wall Street Journal that came out this week, and it's actually the genesis for this whole message. It's called Roughhousing Lessons from Dad. The article talked about this idea that fathers tend to play with their children in what they call a rough and tumble style of play. Sort of similar a little bit to what you see going on here in this picture, which actually came directly from the article. What they are finding is that this rough and tumble style of play that fathers tend to do more often with their children actually has benefits. Even though fathers will often walk a fine line during their play between safety and risk, sometimes even resulting in minor injuries to their children, although without really endangering them, what they are finding is that this helps children develop what they call their emotional intelligence, which is their ability to take sensible risks and to set limits later on in their lives with their peers. When dads push kids in these ways, and through other ways, because studies have shown that dads are the ones that tend to expose their children to more risk than mothers do, but when dads push children in this way, and when it's done in a healthy way, it helps the child to begin to recognize their own limits and to understand their own capabilities and capacities and to become more attuned to healthy risk-taking in the future. Children who don't experience this type of influence tend not to be self-aware of their own limits or the limits that they should practice with other people, and they tend to exhibit behavioral issues later on in life, and they also tend to end up being more aggressive in their relationships. So, even though rough and tumble play sometimes I think is looked down on, or looked maybe by some people, I do think it's an important thing, dads. I don't believe that play is something that we should ever grow out of in life. I believe that it's built into the very fabric of life, and that we should develop more of it in our lives and view it as a gift from God. I think it'll create memories for you. I think there will be moments that you'll never forget, but most importantly, it'll communicate to your child that they're important to you and that you're there for them. So I say play on, dads, and I think that you're going to find that it'll enrich your lives as well.